Alright. Well, let's see if this is gonna work today. My recording connection didn't work in my class last Thursday for principals, and so I hope that this is going to work. Technology is wonderful until it doesn't work, and then it was going apparently between my phone and the thing. I use it to control the recorder. It was going on and off. And so my lecture for last Tuesday didn't get recorded for my principal, so I had to kind of redo it today, and they were a little annoyed by having to listen to it over again. But, you know, redundancy is good. So if it doesn't work today in here, I'll just repeat it again on Thursday, and it'll be good so that you can then get it online if you need to view it for the exams and things like that. So today we're going to start talking about, we took the pretest, and I will post your grades. Everybody gets full credit for taking the pretest. I will post those just as quickly as I can, getting everything set up in D2L. And then we're going to talk today about logic and critical thinking. And you can take an entire course in logic and critical thinking here at the Harvard of the Hills. It's offered in the philosophy department over in the College of Liberal Arts. And it is actually a course that I would recommend that any student take, because so much of life is about argumentation. And for those of you who want to go to law school, you've indicated you want to go to law school, it's the #1 course you can take to increase your score on the LSAT. It's a logic and critical thinking class. So it's a good class. This is what they teach in that class in terms of Boolean logic and things like that is far beyond the scope of this class, but we are going to make a lot of arguments in here, and so it's important to understand something about logic and critical thinking. Now, what I want you to do is, I want you to think about this question for a minute and give me an answer. Is everything that we teach on a college campus either an art or a science? Or is there a third category of thing?
History.
History? Historians would say that's science. They would say that there's a historic way, historiography is a scientific way of collecting and analyzing historical artifacts, and that's a science.
What about mathematics?
Mathematics, I generally think that mathematics is a third category, although mathematicians will tell you that math is science. But I think if it doesn't have some structure or basis in reality, if it's just a nice logic game, then it's not really science, it is pure logic, and that's the third category, is pure logic. And so further and further abstractions of mathematical proofs could be a third category of art and science, between art and science, where it's not clearly one or the other, it's this third category, which is just pure logic. That would be well beyond the scope of this course to get into really abstract ideas of mathematical proofs and logic and those. But those offer foundational bases and insights for maybe a more simplistic version of logic and critical thinking that we'll do in here. And so I often have students say things like, I just don't like to argue. I'm not a confrontational person. Is that what a lot of you would say? No, you like to argue? You want to go to law school? You do? Really, you want to go to law school? No. Don't. Let me disabuse you of why you want to go to law school. I went and got a PhD because practicing law was so miserable. Have you met anything more miserable than going and getting a PhD? That's how miserable the practice of law is, that I went and got a PhD so that I could do something other than practice law. So don't do that. But I did like arguing, and law school is largely about arguing. But does argumentation have any relevance to marketing? Yes, it does. There's an apocryphal story about W.C. Fields. Who knows what the term apocryphal means? What is the term apocryphal?
Attributed to the person after his passing.
What?
Attributed to the person after their passing.
It means that we don't know if it's true or not. It may be true, but maybe it's not true. So there's an apocryphal story about Warren G. Harding. He was the president of the United States at one point. He's generally listed by historians as being one of the worst presidents of the United States. And one of the reasons that maybe he was a bad president, and this is how the story got started, is that it said that Warren's father one day told him, Warren, it's a good thing you aren't a female, weren't born a female, because you would be in a family way all the time. And what his father meant by that is he had an inability to say no, so he'd be pregnant all the time. So there's an apocryphal story about W.C. Fields where a woman comes up to Mr. Fields and says, Mr. Fields, you're drunk. And he says, yes, madam, but you're ugly, and in the morning I'll be sober. Is that an argument? There might be shouting involved there. It might lead to, fisticuffs, but that's not technically an argument. So I think a lot of students tell me, I don't like arguments and I don't like arguing. And what does arguing have to do with marketing anyway? Because they fundamentally misunderstand the nature of argumentation. We make arguments all the time. And marketing is fundamentally about making an argument as to why our customers should buy our products. Now, sometimes we don't do this very well. We do it really poorly. But advertisements are arguments about why you should buy a product. And again, they're not always done well, but they are fundamentally at some level about making an argument as to why this product or service or company is superior. Walmart makes arguments all the time. What's Walmart's argument for why you should shop at Walmart? What's their argument? Since you've worked at Walmart, what is it? Everyday low prices. Their argument is that this is the cheapest place, and it is in many respects. It's the cheapest place for a lot of stuff. Walmart, as a result of their cheap prices, is the largest retailer of soap, textiles, groceries in the world. They're the largest retailer of shoes. They're the largest seller in the world, single largest seller of diamonds, something that you wouldn't generally think of as being associated with Walmart. But they sell more diamonds than any other retailer in the world. So they're the largest at all of these things. And their argument is everyday low prices. They've got that cute little smiley face that's rolling back the prices and making it cheaper. So we make arguments a lot. And so it's important that we understand what argument is. It's not about fighting, it's about offering reasons that we should do one thing and not another. Why should you buy my product over the product of my competitor? So they make arguments all the time about, the value associated with things like cars. And they point to studies that say this is the best manufactured or most reliable car according to Consumer Reports. They tout that and make an argument as to why you should buy one car or another, or why you should buy one product or another. So arguments are important to marketing because we do it all the time. But what we oftentimes find is that people don't do them well. And they engage in logical fallacies or leaps in logic. And that can be fundamentally flawed for them in terms of their arguments. And I find this being done a lot by politicians. We just saw the President's final State of the Union address a week ago today. That was fundamentally a marketing presentation. He was trying to sell America on adopting his vision. And he was making an argument as to why the Obama vision for America is fundamentally better than maybe the Republicans' vision of America and what we want. Because ultimately what he wants is for what? He can't be reelected again, but he wants what to happen? He wants another Democrat to get elected. And so he's making an argument that, hey, under my tenure as president, you've done better than you would have done if you'd elected the other guy. I'm not sure that's true. We could certainly make lots of arguments on both sides. But so we use these in marketing all the time, and we don't necessarily do them well. And one of the reasons that I think that we don't do arguments well is because we get confused on some things that we think are synonyms to begin with that are not necessarily synonymous terms. So in everyday vernacular, a lot of times we use these terms valid and invalid and true and false as being synonyms, and they're not. In the world of argumentation, valid and invalid go to the structure of argumentation and whether or not it is structured correctly, and true and false deal with whether or not there is a basis in reality for the premises that we offer in support of our argument. So you should distinguish between valid and invalid and true and false, and this is also important because one of the logical fallacies that we'll talk about is something called the fallacy of equivocation, or using inconsistent terms, or not using the same meaning for each term. So you should recognize that valid and invalid deal with the structure of argumentation, true and false deal with whether or not the premises in support of our arguments actually have some basis in reality. What you'll find, for those of you that want to go to law school, is that there's this whole section of the LSAT that's called the logic and critical thinking part of the essay, or part of the exam. It's not essay. And what they're going to ask you is they'll ask you a series of questions, and you'll have to select the correct answer based on a logical structure of argumentation, but one that has no basis in reality. So they'll say things like, all snarks are quonks, but not all quonks are snarks, therefore what is a possible outcome? There's no such thing as a quonk or a snark, but the structure of the argument is actually valid. It has no basis in reality. So you need to be able to, some general rules, distinguish between premises and conclusions. Now, one of the things that we talk about in analyzing fact patterns is a methodology called the IRAC, and you should do this with the essays that you'll write for this class. You read the essay and you're going to identify all the issues that are applicable, all of the rules, or all of the issues that are in the fact pattern, identification of the rules, which in this class will be the rules of philosophical ethics and the various theories, the application of those rules to the issues that are identified in the fact pattern, which is what the essays will be about. So you'll have a fact pattern on the essays that will say, you know, business X is planning on releasing a product to market that does da 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 da. So then you'll have to identify all of the issues that go along with that in terms of the ethical implications of those, and then you're going to reach a conclusion. Now, because the structure of argumentative essays begins with a thesis statement, we oftentimes find students not being able to distinguish between their premises and the conclusion, and restating their conclusion as a premise. So the way you write and the way academics write papers is you begin by making an argument. You tell me who you're going to pick a fight with. That's what we do in academic papers. We say, you know, we're going to make an argument here. Usually it's based off of some past literature. So you go and you start the academic writing process by looking and doing a literature review, and you find that there's some gap in the literature that you think that you can explain by doing some kind of experiment or survey or engaging in a thought experiment. And so you start looking at that, and you're going to make a fight, and you start with an introductory part of your paper, which is a thesis statement. So you start with a thesis, and the thesis is actually going to be the basis for your conclusion. So you all remember from high school writing classes, how did they tell you to write your essays? So I had a student several semesters ago who handed in a paper for the article review that you'll do in this class that began with, I approached this problem eager as a squirrel in an oak forest. When wham bam, the answer came to me like an elephant in a circus tumbling routine. And after I read 5 pages of drivel, I wrote at the bottom, I leapt like a gazelle to the conclusion that you deserve an F for forcing me to read this dribble, and you need to take a creative writing course to get this out of your system. So my mother often says to me, I've written several textbooks now, I've written lots of chapters in books, lots of scholarly articles, and she says to me, Grant, your writing is uninspired. Because she's an English teacher. She was a creative writing teacher. So yeah, it is. So you're going to begin with a thesis statement, which is you're going to tell me what you're going to tell me, right? Then you're going to what? Tell me, and then you're going to tell me what you said. That nice triumvirate ring. So thesis, you know, premises, 1, 2, 3, conclusion. And the thesis and the conclusion are going to look a lot alike. What shouldn't look a lot alike are the support that you offer for that. So you're going to tell me what your argument's going to be, you're going to give me your argument, you're going to give support, but you need to distinguish between premises and conclusions. Ask yourself what it is that you're trying to prove, and then what the support for that is, and not simply rephrasing your thesis as support for your argument. And there should be a connection between these, all of this, from this to this to this, that's called a nexus. There's some connection there that connects it all and makes it nice and coherent, so the connections. So the second rule in structuring this is you want to present your ideas in a natural order. Now how should you do that? How are you going to present your arguments for your article review and your group project? What's a nice natural order? How do historians present their argument? What? Chronologically. They present their arguments in terms of their research, in terms of this happened here, and this happened here, and then this led to this. So I just finished reading an H.W. Brand's book on rethinking Ulysses S. Grant as a president. And he basically says, so historians, there's this poll that's done, or has been done in the past. The two authors of the poll are now dead, or the original one. I can't remember who's picked it up, but there's a poll of the ranking of presidents. And it was originally done by Arthur Schlesinger Sr., and it was picked up by his son, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. And they rank the presidents based on a survey that they used to send to historians and political scientists, asking them who are the greatest presidents and who are the worst presidents, and they come up with this ranking. And always at the bottom of that ranking is Ulysses S. Grant as one of the worst presidents of all time, because he had a number of scandals that occurred during his presidency. And so H.W. Brands begins by saying, hey, let's rethink the Grant presidency. Maybe Grant's presidency wasn't all that bad. Maybe he did some things that were really pretty good, and we ought to rethink whether or not he belongs at the bottom of the list with Warren G. Harding, who had this inability to say no to his friends and kept giving patronage jobs to his friends. And so he makes this argument in this new book that he wrote about Grant, about rethinking that, why Grant may not be such a horrible president after all. And I kind of liked the book and am interested in the article because I was named after my father, who was named after an uncle whose father had been in the Civil War and named his son after the general. So in a roundabout way, I'm named after Ulysses S. Grant. And so I kind of like that. And he presents this, and he presents it in a chronological order. You know, this is what happened during his presidency, and that's a nice way of thinking about it. Now, in marketing, is a chronological order maybe the best way to present things?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Why? That's absolutely true. Not necessarily. Lots of marketing scholars don't present things in chronological order. Why?
Or they might focus on what's more important than what actually happened.
Okay. And we may not have a lot of history to talk about if we're talking about the launch of a new product, right? So if you go to journalism school, they'll talk about this inverted pyramid. And the idea of the inverted pyramid is you put your strongest, you tell them what your strongest part is, the most interesting fact about the article that you, or the issue that you are writing about first, right up front. Why? Why do you do it right up front?
Get their attention.
To get their attention, and also recognizing what? What is particularly true of your generation? Students tell me this all the time.
Not the brightest.
They're not, I don't think that's true. But students tell me this all the time. I don't like to read. Reading makes me sleepy. How many of you think that? You don't want to, reading makes you sleepy. How many of you reading puts you to sleep? It's one of the reasons I used to have, the textbook for this class used to be, one of the things I did is after years of getting bad student evaluations on the textbook, I changed textbooks. I actually read them because students would say, I really loved your teaching style, blah, blah, blah. I hated the textbook. I used to have a much thicker text that, I guess this is actually the edition that you're supposed to have, right, the 4th edition. I used to have a much thicker textbook that was full of long quotes by Aristotle and Socrates and Plato and Nietzsche, and students just absolutely hated that. They just hated it because it's hard. So I chose a text that you don't have to, wade through so much. It's much thinner than the old text. So you're not going to read. So the idea of the primacy effect, putting your most important argument first, is that that's what they're going to remember maybe. And we see this, I do some consulting with one of my colleagues on product development for Sonic. And we've done taste tests of various products, and recently we did a taste test, not for Sonic, for another company that contracted with us, to do sampling of people's reaction to frozen yogurt. And you have to mix up the way you sample people when you give them the frozen yogurt, because overwhelmingly most of them remember and like which one the best. The first one that they tasted. Because that's the one that they remember the most usually. And so in judging these quality of things, you have to mix up the samples. You have to rotate them so that you avoid this primacy effect, which is the first one. So you might list that first. Alternatively, you could use the regular pyramid and you put your strongest argument last, and that relies on something called the what? Recency effect. The idea that you're going to hit them with the last, and that's the takeaway, the last thing. So you should try various orders, but present your ideas in something that resembles a coherent, logical, rational thought in the order that works best. So think about that. Those are some ways. That's not necessarily, neither of those are hard and fast rules. There are advantages and disadvantages to both of those. There's advantages to the chronological presentation method if you're doing historiography and things like that. And marketing is a discipline. We do look at the history of marketing thought. And so chronology, if you're doing that kind of thing, might be a nice way of presenting your arguments. You need to start from reliable premises. So again, you can have a logically structured argument, but if your premises don't have any basis in reality, your conclusion is probably going to be weak. So you want both a logical structure to your argumentation and true premises so that you have the best and strongest argument. Anytime you think about it, and you'll find in your articles that you'll do research on, a lot of times people make categorical statements about things, particularly about human nature. And we'll talk about one of these categorical type theories probably starting next week when we talk about the challenges to philosophical ethics. But anytime you see these arguments being made, people always do X. That's kind of suspect in the social sciences. Why? Are there some law-like generalizations? Is there something that you can say is a law-like generalization of marketing? What would be a law-like generalization of marketing? There's a top guru in sales that says, all people love to buy, but they hate to be sold. What does that mean? And is it true?
They don't like the influence.
Yeah, I think we don't like feeling like we're being manipulated. But we all like to buy. Is that true?
Yeah, it's just like walking into Mathis Brothers. You don't like being, followed around with a little shadow by the guy trying to sell you a couch, but
Yeah.
you go shop around and pick out one yourself. So.
The last time I went to Mathis Brothers, my niece was going to law school, and she had graduated from OSU, and she needed a new couch. And so we go in, and instantly here comes this vulture lady that just would not leave us alone, and she's showing us these couches, and we get to one, and she's like, now this is a Henry Don, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and she's going on and on. And it's a $20,000 couch. And I'm sitting there going, lady, we're not gonna buy a $20,000 couch for a kid who's going to law school. That's not gonna happen, right? We don't have the money for that. So I think we're naturally, but we do like to buy. One of the things that we know by using fMRI technology and watching what happens in the brain when you're allowed to purchase things, so we do these experiments where we set things up and we let people purchase stuff from things like QVC online, is that the part of the brain that is activated when you eat your cookie, drink the beer, smoke a cigarette, is activated when you buy stuff. So money can't buy happiness, but it can delay depression. You get that same little hit in the brain when you buy things. Now, is that true that all people like to buy? Well, I think there are examples that we could find of people that don't really like materialistic stuff. Mother Teresa, probably not a big shopper. Had the same outfit every day. So, I don't know. So if you start saying things that categorically are true, you may run into problems. So I think a stronger way of saying that is that most people really like to buy. Most people really like stuff. And that is borne out. We build monuments to our stuff. It's called our house. And we like to fill those monuments with all this stuff that we buy. So start from reliable premises. Use definite, specific, and concrete language. Most of these rules have corresponding fallacies that we'll also talk about. So use definite, concrete, and specific meanings for your terms. You should avoid loaded language. That's language that is meant to persuade people based on emotion. We find this a lot in the political marketing field, that you have people that use loaded language to try and influence people that's not necessarily, great. A number of years ago, I was asked to debate on a campus debate the issue of abortion. And I don't know why they wanted to have this debate, because almost everybody has their own opinion on the topic, and you're not going to change their minds, in my opinion. It's not really wonderful to debate something that you're not going to change people's minds. Why engage in the debate? But they asked me to engage in the debate, and they had somebody else on there. They assigned me, in my part of the debate, the pro-choice stance. And on the other side, they assigned this other person the pro-life stance. And I will tell you that I'm not necessarily pro-choice. I have enormous moral issues with regard to abortion, but I took my assignment seriously, and so I argued the pro-choice stance. And this person on the other side of the debate was obviously very passionate about being pro-life, and he made this argument, a man with a PhD, that if you were pro-choice, you were pro-abortion. And, you're pro-death. That's what he said. I don't know anybody who is on the pro-choice side that says, I think death, is a good thing. And so it was an emotionally charged debate, and I don't think that that's necessarily beneficial. So using that kind of emotional language, but we do it all the time, and we do it particularly in marketing of politics, in the marketing of nonprofits and ideas. ASPCA does it all the time in their ads I have to turn the channel every single time one of them comes on and they play Sarah McLachlan's song Angel. It's definitely an appeal to emotion. And that generally makes for poor argumentation in a sort of judging it for anything other than its rhetorical value. Stick to one meaning for each term. that not doing that is called the fallacy of equivocation. During the debate for the Equal Rights Amendment, there was a member of the United States House of Representatives that stood on the floor and said men and women are not physically equal, and therefore the law shouldn't pretend that they are. Is that true? What's the equivocation there? What term are we equivocating on? Equal. We're equivocating on the term equal. It's true that if we send a male and a female off to the gym, and they're of roughly the same build, who's going to put on muscle mass faster? The male is going to put on muscle mass faster. Who will lose weight faster? The male. So men and women aren't equal. Should we not treat them equally? Equality before the law is something different than equality of physical strength, isn't it? Equality before the law is that you don't judge people based on their gender if you're looking at a crime, or their race. You judge them on whether or not they actually committed the crime. That's equality before the law. Whether or not they can do the job the same. That's equality before the law. Equality before the law is this abstraction. It's not a concrete physical thing. It's this idea that we don't set arbitrary boundaries up and tell people you can't do that. And we did that for a long time in this country. My major professor in my master's program told me that in the entire time she was in college, she was listed as a nursing major. My undergraduate degree and my master's degree were in political science. And she had said when she went to OU that she wanted to be a political scientist. And the advisor at the registrar's office said, honey, women don't become political scientists. You can either become a teacher or a nurse. That was the two things. And so she said, I said, well, put me down for nursing, and then never took a nursing class. And she said, I knew that if I completed the requirements for the degree, they couldn't deny me the degree. And so she went through all of OU being listed as a nursing major while she was taking political science courses, and ultimately got a degree in political science. That's equality before the law. We don't say things like, political science is for boys and nursing is for girls. And vice versa, we don't say to boys, why do you want to become a nurse? Shouldn't you want to become a doctor? That's the idea of equality. We don't judge people on these sort of arbitrary factors that are maybe true in a physical sense, but not in any sense that really matters. Arguments by example. You need to think about, is there more than one example? There are usually, and when you write your papers and when you analyze fact patterns for the exams, is there more than one way that you can look at things? We're going to talk about at least 4 valid ethical theories, each of which may look at a situation slightly differently. And so you should be able to use those to look at fact patterns for each situation, and whether or not there are other examples that you can come up with. So you should think about counterexamples. Your argument will be better if you can deal with counterexamples, and you think about those counterexamples. We often use in marketing and in marketing research samples. What do you have to do to make sure that the sampling in your research is valid? So for example, let's say I want to launch a new high-end watch into the market to compete with Rolex. That's going to be a daunting task to do this, to try and release something to compete with Rolex. Well, let's say that's what I want to do. And I sampled you all as my, sample of whether or not the product is gonna be a success. Is there gonna be a problem with that sample?
Yeah, because none of us can afford it.
Now you're assuming facts, not in evidence, aren't you?
Yeah, but it'd be better to test people that previously have Rolexes. to
Maybe.
see if they like your product better or not.
Why else might just testing you as a launch for my product not be a very good, other than maybe at this point in your life you can't afford it? Although, you might be a good test market because you might be able to afford it in the future, particularly those of you who are going into sales, where you're gonna make lots of money. Our average sales student makes over 6 figures starting out their first year. That's why some of you are sales students, because you want to make 50K base plus commission. So you're gonna be able to afford that Rolex soon, so maybe you're a good product. Why else are you not a good sample of maybe the population?
Size?
Size? What else? Are you really indicative of the population as a whole?
I know.
I don't know. What are you already by virtue of the fact that you're in this class? So this is a 4,000 level class, which means that you all should be what? Seniors. How many of you are seniors? Do I have any juniors? Yeah, I have a couple of juniors in here. But you're juniors or seniors? That already puts you in the economic, or not the economic, the educational elite of our nation. What percentage of our population attempts some level of college or some level of post-secondary education? About what?
40%?
I don't know. It's about 50% of the population that graduates from high school, but the statistic has become skewed in recent years because of what? What's happened to our high school graduation rate in this country? Particularly in states like Oklahoma and New Mexico. We have a high level of percentage of our population that's not graduating from high school, that's dropping out. So we used to say about 50% of the population tried some level of college. But because the dropout rates have increased over the last 10 years, we can't even say that. That means that you're already in the top half of people. Now, if you can get to this level where you're almost graduating, what does that really mean? What percentage actually go through and graduate with a baccalaureate degree in this country? Huh?
Maybe like a percent.
It's 25% of those that graduate from high school. It's about a quarter of our population that graduate from high school and go on to actually complete the baccalaureate degree. Anybody want to get a master's degree? 2 people? What percentage of our population has a master's degree? 7%. What percentage have a doctoral degree? 1%. 1%. What percentage have 2 doctor's degrees?
None.
It's about 0.1%. So you all are already in the education. So, you know, depending on what we're looking at, we need to be cognizant of. Are our examples going to be representative of the population that we're actually studying and the needs of the population that we're studying? Background information is crucial. So we see these kinds of arguments in the old version of the text. I don't know if the new version of this has this example. You should use Slapdish services. We already have dozens of completely satisfied customers in your area. Well, you see these kinds of arguments made in marketing all the time. 9 out of 10 dentists agree that you should use Sensodyne toothpaste for sensitive teeth. Well, what kinds of background information are critical in this? Tylenol makes this argument the most trusted and #1 used pain reliever of hospitals. That's true. That claim is true, but why is it true? And this is where background information becomes critical. Why is Tylenol the #1 most prescribed painkiller in hospitals? They give it to the hospitals for free. they give it to the hospitals for free, and the hospitals turn around and charge you for it. So is that background information? If you want to kill yourself, OD on Tylenol. It's a not coming back. It's very easy to do. So is it really a safe product? I don't know. Should we be, but they can make that claim, but is that background critical to your, whether or not you're gonna use Tylenol as your pain reliever? How many of you drink? Oh, come on, I know more of you drink than that. You mix Tylenol with alcohol, and it can do some serious liver damage. Maybe you wanna think about that.
Is it
So
both
that-
blood thinners?
Huh?
Is it both thin your blood or something?
It does not thin your blood.
No, it's
Aspirin will thin your blood.
Right, it's the liver.
But it's very, very hard on your liver. Your liver has to metabolize it, and the combination of Tylenol and alcohol is just really, really hard for the liver to metabolize. So, that kind of background information, is that critical? The number one choice of hospitals, yeah, I think maybe we ought to think about that. The number one choice of dentists, well, which dentists? How did you select those dentists? Did you give them the toothpaste for free? Is that why that they're?
I feel like there's
promoting?
4 or 5 different toothpastes that say that.
What, the number one dentist recommended
9 out of
toothpaste?
10 dentists.
Yeah. Which dentist are you polling?
It's like the commercials that say, what did the 10th dentist say?
Right, and they show the 10th dentist got knocked out by the squirrel. Yeah. So, those kinds of background information is critical. How did you get to that? Are there counterexamples? We talked about that. Arguments by analogy. Now, we see these a lot, particularly in ethics. We're going to use a lot of analogies. And we see a lot of arguments by analogy in the law, used in the law. And one of the things that we talk a lot about in marketing is this idea of environmental scanning. How many of you remember environmental scanning from your Principles of Marketing class? Right? And what's one of the things that we talk about in that environmental scan? What are the factors that we look at in that environmental scan? Well, there are economic factors, right? Technological factors, regulatory factors. So that's one of the areas. And we see a lot of these arguments being made in the law. And so the law is an important consideration for marketers because it's part of that environmental scan that we'll have to deal with. And we use a lot of arguments by analogy in the law. That is part of our common law system and our heritage from the British, is this idea that you treat similar situations similarly through something called the case method, or case law method, or stare decisis, which is different than you'd find in other places. In other countries that don't have a common law tradition, what do they have? They have a code system, where it's all written down in a book, right? And you just go and you look at the code. And so we find a lot of these arguments by analogy being made in the legal system, and that has obviously an impact on marketing because we operate in that legal system. So what is a good argument by analogy? Well, you have to have roughly similar analogies in order for them to be valid. The analogies, this is one where you don't necessarily have representative samples, but you use an analogy, but the analogies have to be roughly proportional. What is not proportional? What's an example of an analogy that's not proportional? Well, if the fact patterns are so different that they don't lead to sort of similar results, then the analogy is flawed. If you say, for example, and we use these arguments in marketing again for things like comparison. How many of you buy the Walmart brand of things like Listerine? And what's the argument? By analogy that they make. What do they make it right on the label?
Same ingredients.
Yeah, compare to the active ingredients of what? Listerine. So it's a roughly proportional or equal product if the active ingredients are the same. What would not be a roughly proportional or analogous product? Well, what's the active ingredient in Listerine that kills germs? It's basically alcohol. they don't have the alcohol, is it roughly the same? No, not the same. May taste the same, because what's the flavoring that they use in Listerine? Well, there's the old Yellow Death flavor that they manufacture that you can still get. And most people have switched over to the spearmint or, wintergreen or whatever Listerine. But just because it tastes the same, if it doesn't have that same active ingredient, then it's not a similar analogy. Similarly, in the law, should we treat burglary the same as we treat murder? For long periods of time, we did. Common law. Felonies were all punishable by death. Burglary was punishable by death. We've become far more civilized and realized that murder is probably a little worse, isn't it, than burglary. So you have these, if I am offended by the fact that you fall asleep in my class and having a concealed carry permit, I take out my .357 Magnum and smite you. And Dr. Workray, who has a fascination with knives, stabs you to death because you fall asleep in her class. What do you have? Well, you have 2 dead students. Should we have similar punishment? Probably for that. People don't really care why you killed them or how you killed them. It's the fact that you killed them that you shouldn't do, right? So those are roughly similar analogies. Arguments from authority. These are important, and it's important particularly, we start seeing a lot of these in marketing because we start running tests, and so we start looking at whether or not we have a valid argument from authority. So we see these made all the time. Again, the example of 9 out of 10 dentists recommend Crest. Most hospitals recommend Tylenol. Those are arguments from authority. Doctors, 9 out of 10 physicians would prescribe whatever. It's important that in making those types of arguments, you cite the source, because we have to recognize or be able to evaluate the credence properties of the source that we're using. So if we said, for example, 9 out of 10 doctors would prescribe Prozac to their patients, well, is that enough? Just the fact that you have an MD, in this day and age, is it just enough to have an MD or DO? Who do you think might have more validity in determining whether or not we should use Prozac or Zoloft for our patients? Your general practitioner or somebody who has a specialty in psychiatry? That going to have a little bit more credence with you than just your, if we're just asking GPs, how many people, well, a lot of people actually do go to their GPs to get Prozac. But if psychiatrists who have the MD and did a rotation in specialty, a internship, and residency in psychiatry recommended, that means a little bit more. So sources should be cited, and they should be informed. Just because somebody has letters after their name doesn't make them an expert. Lots of people under previous administrations who wanted to deny climate change was occurring would say, well, we have, and George W. Bush found these scientists out there that would say, global warming is not an issue. There's no such thing as man-made global warming, or what we might call anthropomorphic global warming. The problem was that all the experts that he pointed to weren't climate scientists. They may have been biologists or others, but they didn't have any background in climate science. And so the fact that somebody has PhD after their name doesn't mean that they're an authority on everything. Am I, qualified to give an opinion on global warming? Well, no, I have a PhD, but my PhD's in what? It's in marketing. I saw the light, hallelujah. And came over to the College of Business. It's not in political science, thank God. Political scientists make about $50,000 a year. The average salary for a marketing professor is $160,000. So that's why I chose marketing. Just looked at salary schedules and ooh, wow. They make a lot more. Figured that one out real quick. So, I have to be informed. I am an expert in marketing. If you called me to the stand in a case, I could probably give a good opinion on things like trademarks and branding and whether or not one brand is diluting another based on some research that I could do. But I'm not qualified to testify about whether or not the planet is getting hotter. That we have to leave to those people that have PhDs in climate science. So are they qualified to give the opinion? And then another one, are they impartial? There is an old saying, and the tobacco industry did this, and how many of you have seen the movie Thank You for Smoking?
Oh.
You like that movie?
I love that movie.
What did you like about that movie?
His ability to spin.
Yeah, the tobacco industry actually did this. They actually hired scientists to try and prove that smoking didn't cause lung cancer. They actually did this. They hired people, and these people with, MDs were hired to do all these tests and try and say that there's no, cause and effect between smoking and lung cancer and heart disease and all these other things. And so there's an old saying that says it's very difficult to get a man to believe something when his salary is dependent upon him not believing it. And so if you're hired by the tobacco lobby to prove that smoking doesn't lead to heart disease or lung cancer, you may not be impartial. You may have at one time had the credentials to do that, but once you are a captive researcher and your funds are dependent upon your coming up with these conclusions, you may not be impartial anymore. And so who could we trust in those instances to give us an impartial judgment as to whether or not smoking caused cancer? Well, I think we can rely on all of the research institutions that were funded by the National Institute of Health, who just did double-blind studies of factors that affect whether or not you get lung cancer. And it's not just lung cancer now that we know that smoking causes. It causes a whole host of other things, such as what? Heart disease. What else? Emphysema. Yep. Which we've now started calling something else. What? The COPD? I don't know why. We have to come up with new terms all the time. What else is caused by smoking? Women who smoke are 10 times more likely to develop breast cancer. Men who smoke are far more likely to develop prostate cancer. So there's a whole host of things that smoking has led to. So the sources should be impartial. You should rely on things like probably studies from Harvard Medical School rather than the tobacco industry's appointed experts for that. Cross-checking sources is important, so making sure that you look out there and see if there are other sources available, if there are other studies. This is particularly important in things like the manufacturing and marketing of pharmaceutical sales, because these studies, one of the things that we find with pharmacy, and one of the things that I'm interested in my own research, is the ethics of pharmacological studies and selling direct to the consumer. We're one of only 2 nations that sell drugs directly to consumer via direct consumer advertising. The other nation is New Zealand. And so I've gone through and I've started looking at the studies that these drug companies are doing on their products, and what a lot of them are doing is in getting the double-blind review of the efficacy of their drug, they're manipulating some of the statistics like the confidence interval to determine whether or not there is an interaction in the ANOVA. And so being able to cross-check those sources and things like that is important. Personal attacks do not disqualify sources. That's called the fallacy of the ad hominem, attacking the individuals rather than their characteristics. Arguments about causes. It's really important. A lot of times we make arguments about causes in marketing. You know, if you buy X, you will get Y. Causes in the social sciences are often enormously complex, and so it's important to recognize that. So when making arguments about causes, you have to be able to explain how the cause leads to the effect. If you want a chance at a better, we used to be able to say with a lot of confidence that if you wanted to achieve middle class status in this nation, you needed to go to college. Going to college almost guaranteed that you would achieve middle class status. Does it today? No. There are lots of people that are graduating from college that are still, you know, baristas at that horrible coffee joint, the one that I make fun of. Anybody knows what Start? Absolutely hate them. They've like foisted off crappy coffee on the American populace for far too long now. I think they should go broke. So we used to be able to say, you know, if you want to get a better job, go to college. If you want to achieve middle class. The argument that I make now, because it's so complex about what makes someone successful, is no longer that a college education will guarantee you success. But when I talk to young people and they say, you know, I just don't think I'm going to go to college because I don't, you know, I've got friends who graduated from college that are still, you know, working for Starbucks or still working for whatever, you know, Panera. My argument to them is no longer that this is going to guarantee you success. My argument is that you have almost no chance. At least having a college degree will level the playing field and give you a chance. But it's no longer a guarantor of success because causes are enormously complex. And in a highly sophisticated, technologically advanced, integrated world, economics is really hard to understand. And why some people are successful and others are not. It's more difficult than just saying, this is the magic bullet. Does the conclusion propose the most likely cause? Rule number 20 is really, really important. And so this one is particularly important for marketers when we do marketing research and we rely on things like Pearson's correlation. Correlated events are not necessarily cause and effect. So correlation does not necessarily equal causation. One of the things that I read a study on in trying to explain this effect in marketing was, do you want to know what the #1 predictor of family planning in the nation of India was? Whether or not a couple engaged in family planning, you want to know what the #1 predictor was in India? The number of electronic devices that they had in their household. So toaster ovens lead to infertility. Is what, if you look at that, there's a perfect correlation between the number of electronic devices and the low number of children that a household has. Now, there's correlation there. It's high. It had a Pearson's correlation of 0.90, but are toaster ovens causing people to not have kids? Or televisions or whatever causing people to not have kids? No. What's causing family planning and people to not have kids in that? What's the, you know, two causes can be correlated and may have an underlying cause that's actually the, well, what do you think has led to the decrease in the number of children in active family planning among the Indian population in that study? What do electronic devices an indication of in countries, in emerging economies like India? Well, it's an indication of what? It's an indication of socioeconomic status. And one of the things that we know is that particularly in the developing world, family planning, and even in the first world, family planning is far more likely to be engaged in by who? Family planning is far more likely to be engaged in, even in the developing world, by what? People who are wealthy. Why? They can afford it, greater access to education, greater access to resources to ensure that thing doesn't, those things don't happen. So correlated events are not necessarily related. They may have a common cause that is something else. Either of two correlated events may cause the other. So when we look at these studies and we look at correlations in them, we need to be aware that maybe there is an underlying cause. So correlation doesn't equal causation. And again, we see this all the time. We see this done in drug studies where they say, if we look at group A versus group B, this drug seems to work. Well, you might have to look at other things and see if there's other things that are causing it. If you don't have a totally random sample, one of the problems with these kinds of studies in the medical and pharmaceutical industry is it possible to get a totally, completely random sample of people for testing of pharmaceutical drugs? It's not. Why? If you wanted to have a completely random sample, what would you do? How do you get a completely random sample? Every single individual in the population would have to have exactly the same probability of being selected for that sample. Is that how we test drugs? We don't randomly say, oh, hey, you show up at OU, we're gonna shoot you full of Thorazine to see how effective it is. Right? You have to volunteer for those. And so that you have to think about those kinds of causes and effects. Deductive arguments. Now, what we find in the world of ethics, so this combination of philosophical ethics and marketing, is that a lot of the arguments that we'll make are deductive arguments. So one of the thinkers that we'll look at, for example, in this class is Socrates. And Socrates in Republic engages in a deductive argument. It's a thought experiment. And so understanding these types of and structures of argumentation in terms of philosophical ethics is important. A deductive argument of the form called modus ponens, which means the form of adding, is if A, then B, A, therefore B. If it rains, the streets get wet. It rained, therefore the streets got wet. Now this is also an example of how true and false and valid and invalid are important. If I said that today, if it rains, the streets get wet. It rained, therefore the streets got wet. Is that true? No. Is it true? Did it rain today? Is it going to rain today? What's the chance? I don't think so. There's not a big chance of precipitation today. It's cold and miserable out there, but it would be a validly structured argument that's not true. The mode of taking, if A, then B, not B, therefore not A. If it rains, the streets get wet, the streets aren't wet, therefore it didn't rain. Now you can look at these and you'll see some examples of invalidly structured arguments where you overlook the alternative and you can't necessarily say that that's true. So if you flip to the fallacy section of your text and you look at affirming the consequent and denying the antecedents are deductive fallacies or invalidly structured arguments that look a lot like either the mode of putting or the mode of taking, either modus ponens or the modus tollens. So look at those and be able to distinguish between, and what makes those fallacies important is that they engage in an overlooking of the alternative. So if it rains, the streets get wet. The streets are not wet. therefore it didn't rain is valid, but you can't say if it rains, the streets get wet, the streets are wet, therefore it rains, because what makes that an invalidly structured argument in terms of overlooking the alternatives?
Streets can get wet different ways.
Yeah, there's lots of different ways that the streets, how else could the streets get wet?
As far as I know.
Yeah, you could have sprinklers that are going off, what else? Fire hydrant that breaks, water main breaks, the dam out here at Lake Arcadia breaks, gets the streets wet, so it overlooks alternatives. So be aware of those types of examples. I won't expect you to really know hypothetical syllogisms or disjunctive syllogisms, the dilemma. The reductio ad absurdum. Now this is one that we do see used a lot, and we see it used a lot in the political marketing era, in the political marketing arena, and I find that people do it poorly. So it's reducing, strictly speaking, it's a version of the mode of taking. And what you do is you see it reduced to an absurd form, and you prove the opposite of a proposition by showing that the application of the proposition is ridiculous if you reduce it down to its barest form. And what I mean by we see this being used all the time and not used well because they engage in these leaps of logic is in the political marketing arena. We find politicians doing this, and it's usually what we might call, and done poorly, a parade of horribles argument, or the Pandora's box type argument. Now, what are parade of horribles and Pandora's box type arguments? You saw it recently among politicians marketing the culture wars. So, for example, James Dobson, who is the Focus on the Family founder and a licensed psychologist, much to many of our poor, that he actually has a PhD in psychology and was licensed, said, if you allow for gay marriage, the foundations of our society will crumble and fall. It will be the end of Western civilization as we know it. That is a reductio ad absurdum done poorly because it engages in these leaps of logic, right? What are the leaps of logic here? If you acknowledge gay marriage and you sanctify gay marriage, Western civilization as we know it will crumble and fall. That's a parade of horribles argument. What's wrong with that argument? You know, I mean, people will just, you know, be engaging in sin and fornication in the streets. People will be turning gay. And, you know, heterosexual couples will be getting divorced so that they can go be gay. Really? Really? Huh? Okay. And has that happened? We have gay marriage. Has the state of Oklahoma imploded? Has America, you know, fallen away somehow? No. You see these kinds of arguments being used in the culture wars all the time. If you do that, it's a slippery slope. You see the NRA doing this with the gun argument in marketing in the political arena. If we have background, if we have background checks, that's a slippery slope to the black helicopters, you know, taking away they're just waiting offshore. And the Illuminati and the World Trilateral Commission and the United Nations are going to swoop in and take your guns. Really? If we say crazy people shouldn't get guns, that's somehow going to lead to the downfall of the Second Amendment? Huh? Really? Is that true?
I think most people's argument is they're going to get the guns no matter what. Cause most of the.
And that's a
lot of the
logically, that's a
times they're
logical
selling
fallacy in and of
weapons.
itself, right? Because they point to these things and they say, well, that shooter would have gotten the gun. He would have passed the background check. That's not the point. The point is if you stop one, you've done something, haven't you? You stop one and, I mean, no, we're not going to get all of the guns. I mean, we have more firearms in private hands in this country than in all of the armed services combined. We have more firearms in private hands than in all of the armed services in this country combined. You're not gonna get rid of the guns, you know, but the NRA makes this, if you open the door to saying that background, you know, we're gonna enforce the background checks, oh my God, that's just a heartbeat away from the black helicopters and the United Nations and everybody else swooping in and taking our guns. So be careful of those kinds of reductio ad absurdum. That's a good place to stop for the day. I did pass a roll sheet, right?
How was Dollhouse?
It was pretty awesome.
I didn't have as much fun as I usually do.
Oh, really?
I wasn't that bad.
Yeah, that's crazy seeing you both at
I know.
someone looked at my phone.
So Ryan over here straight thugging without a coat.
Yeah, bro.
Freezing.
I'll walk here too. It was just one of those like I've gone too far, I'm not going back.
So come back.
That's what it turned into, I don't.